cruelty, control, and unlimited power over its citizens. Dictatorships are often simplified into a few phrases and ideas by those who live outside of them. However, there is a lot more than what is presented on the surface level. I'm Snoop Dogg, and today we're going to break down dictatorships and how they impact the culture in detail. You may even find similarities with certain methods used in democracies. But first, it's important to understand what a dictatorship actually is by looking at its definition. Dictatorships are classified as a form of government in which absolute power is concentrated in a dictator or a small clique, courtesy of Merriam-Webster. Or as Wikipedia eloquently puts it, a dictatorship is a form of government which is characterized by a leader or a group of leaders who hold governmental powers with few to no limitations on them. Dictatorships can be sorted into 3 to 4 types. The first is the military dictatorship. Military dictatorship is where power is held by military officials who determine leadership in the country and influence the policies. The second type is the one-party dictatorship. This type of dictatorship is where power is held by a single party and the competition for the ruling government is removed. This could be done by banning political opponents from running or banning the formation of other political parties. Then there is the personalist dictatorship, classified as a type of government where power is held by a single individual. And finally, there is the absolute monarchy, a type of dictatorship where the power is held by a monarch without legal limitations. In an absolute monarchy, power is limited to the royal family and legitimacy is established by historical factors. After extensively analyzing the governments previously mentioned, we are going to present how dictatorships change cultural elements by influencing different aspects, such as the arts, traditions, language, and last but not least, group relations. Let's first examine the arts, which lets us look into how dictatorships use this cultural element to persuade and spread the regime's propaganda. Now, propaganda is a word that we hear often, but what is the definition of it? As given by Oxford Languages, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Often, propaganda is associated with many mediums. However, today we will be looking at how visual art was used to persuade and spread the regime's propaganda. In this section, we will be focusing on a particular fascist dictator in Italy who was prominent during the Second World War, better known as Mussolini. For some background information, Benito Mussolini was born in 1883, and his path toward dictatorship started by exploiting the cruising of World War I. He started sharing his ideologies as a journalist in a socialist newspaper called Avanti, and began to amass a group of loyal followers. This group was named Fasci di Combattimento, also known as the Fighting Bands in English, and was composed of nationalist paramilitary forces. After years of terror and intimidation against opponents, Mussolini and other fascist leaders organized in 1922. Mussolini began the march in Rome along with his followers, forcing the king of the Democratic Republic of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele III, to appoint Mussolini as prime minister. In 1925, Mussolini took complete control over the government and dismantled the democratic institutions. He became a self-proclaimed dictator called Il Duce, translated into English as the leader. The Mussolini fascist regime lasted until 1943, when he was voted out of power by his own Grand Council, arrested after a visit with the king, and sent to the island of La Maddalena, Italy. 2 years later, in 1945, he died after being arrested by partisan forces. But how did Mussolini exploit language and symbols to persuade and intimidate people? Between 1909 and the end of World War I, a new art movement was created in Italy called Futurism. Sources state that artists who played a part in influencing the Futurism art movement were sympathetic to fascist ideologies and exploited the movement to support fascist propaganda. The founder of Futurism was Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, and the movement's ideology was violence, virility, and novelty. The first and perhaps most crucial hallmark of Futurism is Marinetti's original The Founding and Manifesto of Futurism, published in the Parisian newspaper Le Figaro in February 1909. Let's look at the first 10 clauses of the Manifesto of Futurism. 1. We intend to glorify the love of danger, the custom of energy, and the strength of daring. 2. The essential elements of our poetry will be courage, audacity, and revolt. 3. Literature having up to now glorified thoughtful immobility, ecstasy, and slumber, we wish to exalt the aggressive movement, feverish insomnia, running, the perilous leap, the cuff, and the blow. 4. We declare that the splendor of the world has been enriched with a new form of beauty, the beauty of speed, a race automobile adorned with great pipes like serpents with explosive breath. A race automobile which seems to rush over exploding powder is more beautiful than the victory of Samothrace. 5. We will sing the praises of man holding the flywheel of which the ideal steering post traverses the earth, impelled itself around the circuit of its own orbit. 6. The poet must spend himself with warmth, brilliancy, and prodigality to augment the fervor of the primordial elements. 7. There is no more beauty except in struggle, no masterpiece without the stamp of aggressiveness. Poetry should be a violent assault against unknown forces to summon them to lie down at the feet of man. 8. We are on the extreme promontory of ages. Why look back, since we must break down the mysterious doors of impossibility? Time and space died yesterday. We already live in the absolute, for we have already created the omnipresent eternal speed. 9. We will glorify war, the only true hygiene of the world, militarism, patriotism, the destructive gesture of anarchists, the beautiful ideas which kill, and the scorn of women. 10. We will destroy museums, libraries, and fight against moralism, feminism, and all utilitarian cowardice. As you can see, the values the manifesto espouses of the art movement are strongly correlated to violence, nationalism, and glorifying war. Futurism was a great influence for the Mussolini regime and helped its propaganda resonate with the people even stronger. Futurism exploited the values of the art movement and helped popularize Mussolini's values of war and terrorism. In simple words, it prepared the audience for the fascist propaganda. Some examples of how Mussolini used and persuaded people to support him can be seen by looking at the electoral posters, which bring agony and a sense of obligation. Another example is the architecture and how it left symbols that represented his fascist regime. Looking at this stadium in Florence, Italy, we see that the main structure was built using the form of the letter D, which represented the term Il Duce, or the leader. Even the resurgence of Roman symbols was used to glorify the regime and bring a sense of unity by exploiting the past and giving a sense of imperialism. This is an example of how the Roman imperialistic style was used to influence the architecture inspired by the Colosseum. Then we have other examples such as posters, where we will often see the Roman fasces, which is a Roman symbol of authority. Everything is concentrated on emphasizing Mussolini's figure and character as the leader. Also, with the support of many youth groups, worker unions, and companies, the fascist regime was able to be present in the daily lives of the people. Propaganda was based mostly on cultural elements and exploitation of historical feelings, persuading people. This was possible through visual art, architecture, radio, theaters, historical values, racial laws, newspapers, and all the mediums available at that time that targeted people. This instrument was successful in giving power to Mussolini and establishing a 2 to 3 decades of oppressive dictatorship. Around the same time, a different dictatorship was brewing in Latvia, a Baltic country that shares borders with Russia, Estonia, and Lithuania. Latvia had a long history of takeovers by both Germany and Russia before their independence. Latvian citizens went from serfs under Russian Tsar rule to indentured servants serving German landlords to liberated democratic citizens of the Latvian Social Republic to being a part of a Latvian-led authoritarian state. This authoritarian state was headed by Karlis Ulmanis, who was once a part of the provisional government during Latvia's first years of independence. He was influenced by dictators like Mussolini and the general fascist wave that took over most of Europe. Many Latvians also saw fascism as the best form of government, supporting the ideas of the Futurism movement. Considering their long history of mistreatment, embracing an ideology that promoted heavy nationalism was popular. That's why when Karlis Ulmanis overthrew the government in 1934, it was a bloodless coup with minimal resistance. During his regime, speeches were done in theaters and had a big public showing. Preparations and expectations for the surrounding residential properties showed what image the Ulmanis regime wanted to portray. Everyone was required to have candles on the second story, and flags as well as patriotic slogans were to be hung on buildings. Props and other distractions were removed. This was done to show the bright future ahead of Latvia and emphasize unity. Plays and theatrical performances were also done to show the benefits of Latvia's new dictatorship. These performances would contain heavy allegories for the current regime and the conflict that multiple parties bring. They were typically historical fiction and contained figures that stood in for current political leaders or enemies. Sometimes they ended by hailing the dictator and taking the performance from allegorical to literal. The purpose of these historical plays was to show that the dictator was eternal and that he existed in all time periods but in different ways. And although Ulmanis's rule was short, only lasting a little more than 4 years, it was the center stage for art, authoritarianism, and extreme nationalism. In dictatorships, tradition can be the backbone of leadership, especially if the dictator's seat is hereditary or has been around for a long time. In China, the latter is true when it comes to their government, sometimes going into the realms of nepotism. In China, tradition dominates everything, including political leaders. Chinese leaders try to evoke certain images from traditional stories or culture to better gain the people's trust. A popular figure to emulate is Confucius, a scholar known for establishing China's ethics and morals, his ideals being humanist and focused on human achievements or problems. Confucius believed in fulfilling one's social roles, and his ideas were the basis of one of China's most prominent dynasties, the Han Dynasty. China's populace has upheld his philosophy on ruling and social order for 2,500 years, continuing to hold modern Chinese leaders to the same standards. Chinese citizens believe in Confucius's idea that if citizens were to go outside their designated social roles, society would collapse. Fixed and stable authority was also another key ideal which allowed Chinese dictators to be regarded as necessary for a society to function. The leaders are viewed as one would view their grandparents or elders, and citizens are expected to show them the same amount of respect. In essence, society is viewed as one big family, and each individual has a place or role they must fulfill. A part of the culture that a dictatorship needs to sustain itself is language. Language is often used to control the population and show what the regime wants to enforce. This can clearly be seen in Argentina during the Dirty War. On March 24, 1976, General Jorge Rafael Videla staged a violent takeover of the populist government of Argentina. This move was called Operation Condor by the United States, who backed and supported the military dictatorship. Before the coup, Videla and his men killed and tortured much of his opposition. The military dictatorship proudly brandished its anti-communist and neoliberal ideology, fighting against any resistance that posed a potential threat to them. Many scholars consider the dictatorship one of the bloodiest of the century, with around 30,000 killed or unaccounted for before its eventual downfall in 1983. The unusual thing about the Dirty War was that the vast majority of people being killed were considered Argentinian citizens by the government. The targets were students, lawyers, journalists, leftists, socialists, people sympathetic to social causes, and those a part of worker and trade unions. Argentinian task forces would kidnap men and women off the streets, take them to hidden concentration camps, and torture them. Victims were gunned down with machine guns, thrown from planes into the ocean, or tortured to death. The government never documented its victims and instead erased them from the world, never giving the families a proper answer as to where their relatives were. 500 children were also taken from their dissenting parents and put with party members who indoctrinated them into their ideology. The military dictatorship in Argentina during the 1970s produced propaganda that tried to frame the current government as progressive and normal. Magazines frequently wrote about things the dictatorship promoted, including traditional family values, keeping order, and the removal of working-class politics. Billiken, a popular children's magazine in Argentina, featured a key message of hygiene and cleanliness. They frequently used war allegories while talking about fighting the common cold or tooth decay. At the same time, Billiken promoted conservative ideas of race and gender roles. The news advocated for public support of the government and to go out of their way to be good citizens. After the military seized control of a news station, the station began reporting on only good news and military accomplishments, completely ignoring the atrocities committed by the dictatorship. On top of that, State-controlled TV would only air normal broadcasting like reality TV or soccer in an attempt to paint the picture that there was no massacre. As seen in Argentina during the Dirty War, dictatorships often target certain groups that pose a threat to them or that can be used as scapegoats. In our case, we'll be looking at the cultural religion of a country and its history of hundreds of years being destroyed in a few decades due to a communist dictatorship. This regime created the first atheist state, prohibiting all religions and their symbols. The country we're looking at is Albania, a small country in the Balkans surrounded by Greece, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and Montenegro, with a population of circa 3 million. Enver Hoxha was the name of the leader of the Communist Party in Albania, and it was the only political group that had complete power over the entire country. According to sources, it was one of the worst communist regimes, due to its isolation from the rest of the world and the cruelty it enacted. Some go as far as to call the regime psychopathic. Enver Hoxha ruled from 1944 until his death in 1985 from a stroke. We are not going to explain the entire history of the regime, but we will focus on religion, which has influenced the culture of Albania for more than 400 years under Ottoman rule. In communist Albania, religions were prohibited and punishable with more than 10 years of jail and torture. Religious leaders were often assassinated as well. Albania had always been invaded by other empires, and therefore it had shifted from one religion to another based on who the leader was at the time. For the last 400 years, Albania was mostly Muslim, being 70% of the entire population, while the rest were Christians, Catholics, and Orthodox. Albania historically has always been a midpoint between the Islamic and the Christian world. It lies between the boundary of the Western and Eastern empires, and Islam wasn't perceived as a violent conversion. So, what happened to religion, and how was it handled during the regime? In 1944, when the communist regime took power over the entire country, the party released its new constitution, which separated church and state and affirmed the fundamental right to freedom of belief. Belying the constitution, however, anti-religious activity commenced almost immediately after the new government was formed. In August 1945, the government passed an agrarian reform law that deprived religious institutions of much of their property. A series of show trials and executions were held, following which the Jesuit order was banned in 1946, along with the Franciscans in 1947. In 1946, all foreign Catholic priests, nuns, and monks were expelled. Many priests were imprisoned, executed, or assassinated. However, the regime did not start to immediately prohibit religion and its practice. But after a few years in 1947, the chaos began, and the Communist Party recommended introducing anti-religious teaching in schools. The government halted religious instruction by clerics and lay people even within homes. In 1949, the government passed Decree number 743 on religious communities. The decree stated that religious practice must not contravene the laws of the state, law and order, and good customs. The same decree has also ordered that each of the 4 major religious communities, Muslim, Bektashi, which is a Sunni Sufi order, Albanian Orthodox, and Catholic, they were each required to draft a statute within 90 days pledging the religion's loyalty to the party and the People's Republic of Albania. In 1966, the Albanian Party of Labor initiated its ideological and cultural revolution. It started spreading anti-religion ideologies, creating a cultural identity that did not possess religion and deleting hundreds of years of history. In April 1967, the government adopted Decree number 4236, allowing the local executive committees and cooperatives to expropriate without compensation all fixed assets of religious communities and the contents of the religious treasuries. By September 1967, all religious buildings, including 2,169 churches, mosques, monasteries, and others, had been closed. Some were converted into stables, warehouses, cultural centers, or housing. Shkodër Cathedral was turned into a sports center with a basketball court in the old nave. Other buildings were torn down. If people continued to venerate the remaining piles of stones, the sites were cleared. After the decree was passed, all religious symbols were prohibited and only the communist star was permitted. No one could use religious words such as Mashallah, Inshallah, Christ has risen instead of good morning, and many others which were part of the culture as they are again today after the fall of the regime in 1991. By 1975, the regime had killed 28 Islamic leaders, executed 26 Greek Orthodox clergy, 6 Catholic bishops, 4 monsignors, and 56 parish priests, 30 Franciscans, 13 Jesuit priests, 10 seminarians, and 8 nuns between torture and execution. Lastly, those who survived were imprisoned for life or went into hiding from the regime. One Albanian theorist describes the party's thinking. Although used for economic and cultural purposes, nearly all of the houses of worship preserved their former appearance. Apart from other things, this situation reminded believers of the church or the mosque, causing them to continue to regard them as holy places. Such a site could not but have a negative psychological influence on the younger generation. Instructions were issued to undertake a series of corrective measures. Those religious edifices that interfered with the city or village layout and zoning requirements were to be destroyed, and in their place, new buildings were to be erected. Likewise, religious edifices that were old or threatened to collapse and had no architectural value were destroyed. As for those edifices that were used for different needs, such as cinemas, houses, and hearths of culture, gymnasia, etc., slight renovation work was done on them to change their external appearance. The new Constitution of 1976 and the new Criminal Code of 1977 codified the Albanian government's campaign against religion, which began in 1946 and intensified in 1967. Article 37. The state recognizes no religion whatsoever and supports atheist propaganda for the purpose of inculcating the scientific materialist worldview in people. Article 49. The parents are responsible for the upbringing and communist education of the children. Article 55. The creation of any type of organization of a fascist, anti-democratic, religious, or anti-socialist character is forbidden. Fascist, religious, warmongering, anti-socialist activity and propaganda are forbidden, as is the incitement to hatred between peoples and races. Albania was the first atheist country under the communist regime. Then, after the 1991 elections, the regime fell, and a new party took over. People started taking back their faith and rebuilding religious places in order to be able to profess again freely. Albania has received financial help from countries like Turkey, Italy, and others to rebuild each religious community that the regime tried to suppress. However, religion was never completely destroyed in the lives of Albanians because some were able to secretly continue their religious practices. According to the 2011 census, Albania has a religious demographic of 56.7% Muslim, 10% Roman Catholic, 6.8% Orthodox, 2.5% atheist or agnostic, 2.1% Bektashi, 5.7% other, and 16.2% unspecified. Something else to note is the debate presented on the reliability of the demographic reports. Some say that Albania has a high percentage of irreligiosity equaling 39% of the population. Also, there are cases where the religious identity is assigned by attribution, usually by family history rather than actual practice. Alas, the end of the documentary has come. Now that you've seen how dictatorships and people are being influenced and exploited through their culture, I hope you've developed a deeper understanding or view of this type of government. We have looked at many countries in different contexts, but the common subject is emphasized, and that is understanding the culture that you want to control. I will leave you with a new question to be answered. How would see yourself living in such circumstances, and are you sure you wouldn't be persuaded to follow the leader? Now, my job here has concluded, and the other members of the group will show the opinions of those inside and outside of dictatorships. After, you will be asked for your own views on the same questions.